So welcome everyone. Before we get started, we want to make sure you know that we are offering live interpretation in Spanish. So I'm going to ask one of our interpreters, Ana Rueda de
Vidales. I'm sorry.
Thank you, to invite you to the Spanish audio channel. Ana.
Okay. Buenas tardes, soy Ana Rueda de Vidales y yo voy a estar interpretando este día para ustedes. Para poder escuchar la interpretación en español, tienen que darle clic al pequeño icono que dice interpretación, elegir su idioma de preferencia, español, y ustedes tienen la opción de poder mute original audio para escuchar solo la intérprete, o si no, van a escuchar a la intérprete a un 80% y al ponente principal a un 20%. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. And before we start in earnest, I want to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the indigenous peoples of the Muwekma, Ohlone, Ramaytush, and Tamian Nation on which we are learning, working, and organizing today. We are committed to honoring and making visible the indigenous people and tribes that were intentionally displaced from their land, who remain here in Silicon Valley and are a part of our community. And while we're taking this moment, I do want to acknowledge the lives that were lost in Texas earlier this week and in Buffalo, New York last week. And our thoughts are certainly with those of our community who are really hurting right now. Affordable Housing Month in May 2022 is focused on reimagining home. And so it is a series of educational and engaging events and activities that have highlighted throughout this month housing challenges and solutions while providing opportunities for the public to get involved, learn more, and act. And so couldn't be a more perfect way to sort of talk about acting than with our policy and action event. Throughout SB at Home's Affordable Housing Month, dozens of local partners have presented with us in over 50 events this year and have engaged thousands of residents throughout Santa Clara County and the region, both virtually and in person. We have been having invigorating conversations on what it means to reimagine home and how to put it into practice, creating affordable, accessible, and equitable Santa Clara County we want for all of our families and our community. So we ask that you continue to participate with us with this event during Affordable Housing Month. This is actually our first monthly policy and action event. We have a regular monthly series at the same time that we have called the Hack in the past. And so we've changed the name to really talk about action, emphasis on action and policy. And so we hope you like the new name, and we thank you all for coming to this very first policy and action conversation. This is, again, a conversation that we've been having on a monthly basis on Fridays at noon for quite some time. It's discussion-based, it's action-focused, and Silicon Valley at Home, we've been hosting this on a regular basis. So this event is meeting style by design. We really want as much interaction as possible. We want to capture the sentiments that you all have, the feeling of meeting in person and interacting in person. And so in that spirit, we encourage you to keep your video on if you're able to, and create as much of a community dialogue as possible. For today's event, we have asked our sister organization, the SB at Home Action Fund, to discuss what they've been working on and share what's happening in state legislation and local elections. So very excited about this policy update, or this legislative update. So I'm excited to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Candice Gonzalez. She has so many years of experience building housing in this Silicon Valley, including affordable housing. She's currently the Chief Housing Officer at Sand Hill Property Company, and she is a member of SB at Homes Board and the chair of SB at Homes Action Fund Board. And I'm so grateful for her and the work that she's doing with our organization. And so I'll hand it over to Candace.
Thank you so much, Regina. I'm so excited to be part of our grand finale for Affordable Housing Month. Before we get started, I just want to share a few ground rules. I know that a lot of us housers are quite passionate, so we want to ensure that the conversations and relationships here today remain respectful and productive. Please be kind and courteous to each other. We will not tolerate rude comments or personal attacks. We do encourage asking questions and listening as we learn and engage with each other. Please keep comments and questions focused on state legislation and local elections, our topics today. Sometimes the chats can get lively, so if you find it distracting, we encourage you to consider closing the chat. With that said, before we begin, probably a lot of you are wondering what is a C3 versus C4. One of the first things I should explain is the difference between SB at Home and SB at Home Action Fund. SB at Home is a 501c3 created in 2015, while SB at Home Action Fund is an affiliated 501c4 created in 2019. A 501c3 and C4 are both nonprofits, but a 501c4 is able to do more political work. So as a 501c4, the Action Fund does more in the areas of direct lobbying on legislation and state funding, ballot measure support or opposition, candidate engagement, and voter education, just to name a few things. So as an event preview, we're going to talk first with Graciela Castillo-Krings about state legislation and budget advocacy. We also have a surprise special guest joining us for this part of the conversation. Senator Scott Wiener, chair of the California Senate Housing Committee, is coming to us in real time. So we're really excited about Senator Wiener joining our conversation. After Graciela, we'll talk with Corey Wallback about local elections and the Action Fund's work there. Immediately after each presentation, I'll probably ask a few questions, and then we will open it up for audience questions for all the speakers. So please put your questions in the chat. So up first is Graciela Castillo-Krings. She is part of the team at Sacramento Advocates. Graciela has spent over 16 years in and around California government. Prior to becoming a lobbyist, she spent 5 years as a deputy legislative affairs secretary to Governor Jerry Brown. Graciela now represents SB at Home Action Fund in Sacramento.
Thanks, everyone.
And Graciela, sorry, do you mind if I just say a couple words about Senator Wiener before you begin?
Please. Yes.
Senator Wiener, as probably most of us already know, he represents the 11th Senate District. He has been a strong housing champion in the state legislature with bills like SB 35 and so much more. Senator Wiener is the chair of the California State Senate Housing Committee. So thanks, Graciela, it's yours.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Really excited to be here today. And we just wanted to give you a quick overview of what is happening in the legislature. First slide, please. So one of the things that I just wanted to highlight how we ended up kind of becoming so active in Sacramento. And it really started with Casa. As many of you know, Casa originated in 2017, and it was really an effort by MTC and ABAG to convene Bay Area leaders to really move forward affordable housing, ensuring that our tenants were protected, ensuring that we were doing what we could to actually do additional production. And because of the work that Casa did, we call it the 3Ps framework, it really started to change the dialogue in Sacramento. So this conversation that is now happening statewide really started in the Bay Area. So we're really excited. And one of the things that I've been hearing is people in Southern California, especially in LA, are looking at the Casa model and trying to replicate it in LA because they realize how successful it was to bring different people from in leadership areas to try to kind of get to solutions. Next slide. So kind of where we are in the legislative timeline. Right now, we just had a really exciting week, what we call the House of Origin deadline, which is any bill that was introduced in the Senate has to be voted off the Senate floor to the Assembly and vice versa. So now the other house has each other's bills, and they're going to start having hearings. We could move very quickly this year. Basically, hearings are already starting up next week, and things are going to continue in the process. And all of that is going to basically, hearings are going to continue to happen until July 1st. And then the legislature takes a quick break for about a month. They come back in August. And then we basically are trying to finalize and wrap up the session. The other big timeline for us to highlight is the June 15 deadline. June 15 deadline is a constitutional deadline that the legislature has to approve a budget that will basically go into effect July 1st. So all of those conversations are happening right now. It's a very active time in the legislature. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview on the budget. So as you may have read already, the May revise came out in the middle of May, and it kind of surprised everybody that we have over 300 billion in our state budget. That is just a crazy amount of funding, and 97 billion is actually a surplus. So we're not anticipating those revenues. Next slide, just to highlight some of the actual housing and homelessness allocations that were given in the May revise. We have additional funding. The governor has been focusing on trying to ensure that we are thinking of housing and climate as one, basically one policy. And he is putting additional funding in what he's calling the adaptive reuse. And this is kind of converting old malls, converting other areas that might not be as efficiently utilized in trying to convert that into housing. There's additional funding in there for encampment, cleanups, and additional funding for home key funds, because as we know, home key has been actually one of his big programs that he really supports. So he's putting additional funding in there. And then HAP funding, I just want to highlight that one, is homelessness, housing, assistance and prevention program. And so there's going to be additional funding in there. I think there is, at the end of the day, we still have another probably week before we see what the Senate and the Assembly actually preview as their legislative package. So that's still kind of in negotiations, and we will see a lot of conversations back and forth as the two houses and the governor finalize the budget. And we will obviously there has to be a vote on it by June 15th. Okay, next slide. So a couple of big pieces of legislation that we are watching closely. And there's more, but these are just a few that I wanted to highlight. AB 2011, which this one is really an attempt by Assemblywoman Wicks to start a conversation with labor and try to figure out what the right approach will be. And it's looking at creating ministerial approval, which is basically having city staff approve projects if they are located in office or parking or vacant retail areas, to ensure that we have more housing opportunities. The other piece that we are excited to see is ACA 14. And this one is important because it basically would be a constitutional amendment that she's trying to place on the budget this year. And if it doesn't go, it would have to be passed by June 30th in order to get it on the budget. I'm sorry, on the ballot for this year. If it's not on the ballot for this year, it will be on the next general election. But the idea would be to set aside 5% of the general fund revenues to actually fund housing. And again, when you think about 5% out of 300 billion, it could be a significant investment. So this is going to be another one, and it would only be for 10 years. The other bill that I just want to highlight quickly is ensuring SB 948 by Becker, which is just trying to kind of create additional, it would basically help HCD do a little more projects when it comes to affordable housing. All right, next slide, please. Any questions? I know I covered a lot, but I want to make sure that we get into a conversation with the senators. Any questions?
No, thank you, Graciela. I think I'll probably dive into questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience as well. Before going into questions, though, I'd like to open it up to Senator Wiener to share any comments on the state of housing as well. And welcome again, Senator Wiener. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, there is, it's a time of, I think, change in the legislature, and not just because we're getting a lot of new members and but we have started to see more diverse points of view within labor, which I think will shake some things up and potentially lead to a resolution where we can have a path forward on a number of housing policies that have frankly been stuck for a few years because of the disputes between labor and the affordable housing community in particular. I don't know what the final endpoint is going to be, but we now have literally 3 different perspectives. We have the building trades have a perspective, and then some of their subcomponents, the electrical workers and the pipe trades, have taken a modified point of view to what the trades have been advocating, and the carpenters have gone their own way in AB 2011. And so my hope is that we will see everything shaking out and have some sort of, if not consensus, then some more of a consensus so that we can move forward some long overdue housing measures. I very much want to advance the church housing bill that we did in 2020 that got caught up in labor disputes. We need to remove the sunset on SB 35 and a number of other ideas. We're also, I think, we're seeing, the work we did a few years back on housing element and RENA reform is bearing fruits now. The RENA numbers, as you know, are dramatically higher. Housing elements are tighter. The enforcement is not perfect, but it's a lot more than it was. And I want to thank all the individuals who are boots on the ground, alerting HCD and others when there are problems with, when their cities are running scams with their housing elements. To be clear, a lot of cities do not do that. They work really hard. The city of LA is an example of a city that's worked really, really hard and is almost there. But there are some cities, as we know, who have tried to run scams, and that's no longer tenable. And so we're going to see some additional, I think, work done this year on housing element law. And it's all slow and lumbering, but the fact that Woodside was knocked back in about 24 hours on their, sort of laughable mountain lion proposal, and Pasadena backed down on its abuse of historic districts, I'm hoping that something will happen in San Francisco around the abuse of the historic district exemption that we've seen recently in San Francisco. But I think we're heading in a positive direction. We're also seeing continued investment in affordable housing in the state budget compared to where we were 5 years ago. It's night and day. And so I feel good about where we're going, but we have a lot more work to do. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Senator Wiener, and thank you again for your continued leadership when it comes to housing. I do have some questions, and it's open to Graciela or Senator Wiener to answer, and let's look out for the audience questions as well. But to kick it off, how is coordination on housing priorities between the Senate, the Assembly, and the governor?
Well, I mean, I will say that Assemblymember Wicks and I we're very, very close, very aligned. We talk all the time. We talk several times a week on our own legislation, other bills. And so Assemblymember Wicks and I stay very closely coordinated. We also stay coordinated with the local government chairs, Assemblymember Curry, and with Senator Caballero. And then, of course, our staffs, the committee staffs on all 4 committees in 2 houses we coordinate very, very, very tightly. Often where we try to take all the amendments in one committee instead of doing it in both committees, just that both committees work together up front so we don't have chaos with bills getting chopped apart in different committees. And I think we have better House coordination than we did a few years ago. It's still not perfect, but it's improving. And the Assembly now has their own sort of informal housing caucus, which is helpful. In the Senate, we don't really have that, but there are fewer of us, so it's easy for us just to sort of coordinate together.
Great, that's good to hear. In the proposed January budget, the governor highlighted that housing is climate change policy. How is this concept shaping conversations and legislation? Again, it could be you or Graciela's.
And I can take that, and Senator, would love to get your thoughts on it. But I think for many people that have been working on housing, like the senator, for him, it's been a no-brainer, right? You have people that have understood the connection, the actual interplay. When you look at other communities, you think of LA actually is a perfect example. You look at some of the communities surrounding LA, like the Imperial Valley, or you look at Riverside and Moreno Valley, all of those communities have grown because housing has become so expensive. And when people are commuting 2 hours one way, 4 hours a round trip, we're not going to get to the type of GHG reductions, greenhouse gas reductions that we want, unless we address people living closer to where they live so they can take public transportation, bike, or actually walk to work. But we're not going to do that without re-envisioning how we actually build communities. And so I think that's the reality, and it's kind of what we're grappling as conversations in the legislature have started to kind of explore where we should be building, especially because climate change is impacting, right? You look at fires and where they're happening, we need to re-envision how we build those communities. And it's becoming, I think people that have been working in the space for many years understand that, but I think it's becoming more of a mainstream discussion. And I think it's a really exciting one. We have a big opportunity here, but it is going to take work, and it is taking work, like with the piece of legislation that the senator has been working on for years, like SB 50, SB 10. So Senator, any thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time, the last part?
Just on how legislation, some of the legislation that we will need to really make that real impact, right? Do you think the conversation is changing now?
I think it is. I think if you look at like just the votes on some of these bills, I'm not saying it's easy. It's never easy, but it's a lot. Things are going a lot more smoothly than they did even a few years ago. And I think there are some points of contention that were very contentious a few years ago that are much less contentious now. And so we're seeing more CEQA streamlining happening around housing. I think people understand that it's not tenable for projects that meet all the rules to take years and years to be approved. And even with the opposition of the building trade, we're seeing some housing movement. To be clear, I want to reach a resolution with the building trade so we can all lock arms and move forward together. I really dislike the fighting that's happening between the housers and labor. They should be aligned. But you have bills that even have strong opposition that still pass. So again, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's getting less difficult.
It'll definitely be interesting to follow how housing justice, how we bridge the gap between housing justice and climate justice. So thank you for those comments. Second question for you, SB 9, which legalized duplexes, and SB 10, which makes it easier for cities to upzone some areas up to 10 homes per property, passed last year. These were priority bills for the Action Fund, and how is implementation going?
Well, in SB 10, I think it's going to take a little time for cities to figure out how to use it. It's, a lot of these new laws, it just takes time. SB 35 started really slowly, and it took about 4 or 5 years for it to really accelerate. We know there are cities looking at SB 10 rezoning, and the city's Mayor Gloria in San Diego has said they intend to use it. I think we'll see some other cities over time using it as well, especially as they need to rezone under their housing element. But that's a slow start, but we expected it would be a slow start. Mm-hmm. SB 9 is also a slow start, but not as slow. We're seeing, projects moving forward. We're seeing cities are trying to figure out the cities that want to implement it are figuring out how to do it. But with all these bills, it's always a slow implementation. It never happens immediately. And these two laws have been in effect for less than 5 months. So it's not surprising that it's difficult.
Mm-hmm. And with that, actually, an audience question came in. Since you mentioned SB 35 and the slow start, are we seeing any significant challenges to extending SB 35?
Well, I had contemplated introducing that bill this year. I decided that it's too high stakes to do it while there was labor tumult happening, and so I decided I want to wait for that to settle which I'm cautiously optimistic we'll see some significant progress this summer. And so then if that happens, I could introduce that bill in like December and try to move that next year. And so my hope is also that the only opposition to it would be some cities and NIMBYs. Again, I don't want to have to fight all the fights with everyone, right? We want to minimize that. I think one of the challenges will be, as SB 35 has succeeded and had more and more projects in more and more parts of the state, some of those projects are controversial. And occasionally there's a bad project, because you can't solve for all the bad projects, or it could be a good project, but it's controversial. Like Burbank has there's like some beloved ice rink that's being redeveloped. And so that can foment more local opposition because people are upset about this or that project. And so that could be a challenge, but I suspect we'll have a broad coalition supporting it.
Great.
And by the way, my intent is to remove the exemption for the coastal zone. We no longer do coastal zone exemptions in the Senate. It's elitist and just inappropriate.
Great, good to hear. And thank you for your work on this. I know that lots of us would like to see the extension happen. So with HCD's new enforcement unit and the Attorney General's, I think, housing strike force starting to file lawsuits against cities, has this changed the political dynamics for passing new legislation?
I haven't heard it. I think people are happy the law is being enforced. I think there was a frustration, pretty broad-based, about seeing cities take absurd positions and sometimes getting away with it. Mm-hmm. And so I've not heard anything from, I think colleagues sort of, in a way, it's like, okay, good, someone else is enforcing it. Mm-hmm. We don't have to be the bad guys. and so I think my sense is people appreciate it.
Yeah. And just to add to that, right now, I know that the governor, when the unit was created, also added additional resources, because HCD is trying to kind of ensure that all of the localities understand what the laws are and how to actually implement them. And I think they're really trying to kind of give them technical assistance and try to get them there right before they actually enforce. They're not going out there and enforcing right away on everything. Now, you have some instances where just having somebody watching, for example, the city of Woodside, when they tried to basically say that the entire city was actually a protected habitat, just a quick letter from the Attorney General saying, hey, I don't think that's the right interpretation of the law, was enough for them to basically go back and revisit that decision. So just having that level of accountability without actually going to further in actual lawsuit has really changed the behavior of some of the cities.
Yeah.
And I want to reiterate that, because I think from the city's perspective, San Francisco, LA are probably more exceptions. So San Francisco is being a bad actor in some ways. And we've seen, San Francisco sort of ignore the Attorney General's letter with the illegal rejection of the Stevenson Street project. But San Francisco has a massive city attorney, my former office, city attorney's office, and can deal with disputes with the state. Most cities do not want to incur legal bills on a lawsuit they know they're going to lose. And so, even, Berkeley back in the day used to just ignore state housing law, get sued, reject projects illegally, get sued, lose, continue to refuse to approve the project, get sued again, but they've stopped. But if you don't have resources, then it's just a big waste of your limited budget. And so I think that's why why Woodside backed down so quickly. I think it's why Pasadena backed down so quickly. And so it's good they get a confidential memo from the city attorney saying you're going to lose, you're going to have to pay attorney's fees, you're going to have to pay penalties. And so they back down.
Great. One quick note, it looks like our Spanish interpreters are experiencing some connection issues, so we are trying to help them with some of the technical difficulties. So sorry for that, and we appreciate everyone's understanding and patience.
I apologize. I apologize. Jump off, and so.
Okay, well, thank you so much again for your leadership. We look forward to what the coming year brings for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you again, everyone. And that was a nice surprise visit. Graciela, I think I do have another question. I know we're going to head to Corey soon, but one more question for you.
Yes.
And any others from the audience. Over the next 4 years, there are a large number of legislators retiring or terming out of office. What is your sense about the new candidates and how much might this impact discussion in the legislature? Are you feeling hopeful?
I actually am. I think you have a lot of younger legislators that are being severely impacted by housing. I think a perfect example is Assemblymember Lee, right? He's in his mid-20s, he's still living at home. He's having a hard time actually purchasing a home and being able to experience that opportunity. And I think coming to office with that perspective and experiencing how expensive rents are, how difficult it is, I think it just really kind of highlights for everyone that this is a real problem. And so I've heard a lot of the candidates that I've been talking to actually highlight that housing is one of the key issues for them. So I think back to what the senator was saying, that level of information and perspective, I mean, when it's something that is impacting you, I think you bring that passion to the legislature. And so I am hopeful that as we continue to have these conversations, you're going to have members that are going to basically be voting for what used to be kind of non-starter conversations. A good example of that is there's been discussions about reducing the amount of parking right now. 10 years ago, that bill did not even make it out of the first policy committee, right? And now we have both houses actually carrying pieces of legislation to reduce the amount of parking. And so it's changing, things are changing. And so I am hopeful.
Good to know. And then another question, I have lots of questions and hoping audience comes in with some other questions as well. Apart from restrictive zoning laws, what are practical barriers that local governments face that prevent them from producing additional housing? And sometimes we know that people are a barrier.
Yes, and look, I think what's so complicated when you have over 400 cities in the state of California, it's hard to paint everybody with the same brush. You're going to have some cities that are trying to do the right thing, but might be small and might not have additional funding for infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I mean sewer upgrades, water upgrades, things like that, that we just need to ensure that we're able to accommodate the level of density that we need. And so the reality is a lot of local governments, some of them that are trying to do the right thing, don't have funding for infrastructure. So those are some of the conversations we need to keep having and trying to figure out how do we help them? How do we ensure that they are able to get there is something that is important. So that would be one of the challenges I think has been identified.
It looks like there's a lot of positive movement for sure. But why does it seem like that there are more unhoused people now more than ever before, despite a lot of the state investments made over the last few years? It's just really seems to have gotten worse during the pandemic, obviously.
Yes, and one of the things, I mean, people don't like to hear this, but it's true. The reality is we didn't get to this crisis overnight. It has been over decades of not producing enough units and enough affordable units. And so it's going to take us a little while to kind of get there. Going back to what the senator had mentioned, right? SB 35, all of these pieces of legislation take a few years for them to really start ramping up and to deliver the results that we need. At the end of the day, I think we're finally back on track trying to ensure that we have additional funding. But that just happened. And so I think as we continue to push for additional funding, additional changes in law to make it easier to produce affordable housing, those are the things that are really going to get us out of this quagmire. The problem is it's not going to happen overnight.
Great. And I think I have one last question for you. It's on a similar note. There's been a lot of bills that have passed to make changes to zoning laws and housing elements. We've seen ADU laws, and that seems to produce some tangible results. What else is missing besides time? Why are we not seeing impacts more readily?
I think, again, we have an opportunity this year and even next year, as we have a surplus, to really try to dedicate a sustained amount of funding. I think overall, if you look at how the funding in the state, it's been it goes up, it goes down, and we don't have a sustained funding source. I think that's one of the reasons ACA 14 is so important, is because at the end of the day, we need some serious, not just reform on the legislative front, but also in like just ongoing investment when it comes to affordable housing.
Great. Thank you so much, Graciela, and thank you again for your presentation and your insight about what's going on in Sacramento. We can move on to part two.
Actually, I think I saw one more question. There was one more question from Rob Moore in the chat. It was just announced, I think there's a story in Politico that Robert Rivas, representing parts of southern Santa Clara County and the area south of that, will be the next Speaker of the Assembly. And how will this impact state housing policy?
Yes, so very exciting. That has been this morning, that has been the rumors in Sacramento, and it sounds like, yes, he will be our next speaker. It sounds like we should have a formal announcement next week with a transition plan, but he has been, I would say that you have a cohort in the Assembly who have been real champions and leaders. He's one of them, right? Assemblymember Grayson, Assemblymember Wicks, they've been fighting for housing and housing at all levels. So it's really exciting to understand. The other thing about him, again, it's housing for him is a real personal story. His background, he was basically, he's a child of farm workers. And so he's lived in overcrowded conditions, and he knows what it's like to basically struggle to have a roof over your head. So I think it's really exciting to have somebody like him in charge, and I look forward to additional leadership from him.
Great. And I think now another question has come in for you, Graciela. Is Senator Wiener going to raise $20 million to put SCA 2 on the ballot now, as reported in the press, or is it better to wait and put it on in 2024?
Those are the discussions that are being had. At the end of the day, I think there is support to put that on the ballot. The problem is here's the issue. Politically, it could negatively impact if we don't raise enough money to run a political campaign and the initiative fails, it's going to make it really hard for us to come back and actually run it again. So we want to make sure that we are being strategic so that it's thoughtful, that we don't lose. Anytime you basically are trying to explain to a homeowner that they're losing some type of discretion, they are automatically going to say no, right? So I think he's really going to try. Again, I can't say that he's not going to do it, because Senator Wiener, usually once he puts his mind behind it, he doesn't take no for an answer easily. So we hope that can happen. But yes, the reality is we need some serious investment in order to run a full campaign and have that be successful.
Great. Thank you again. And I think with that, we can move on to part 2, local elections with Corey Wallback. Corey Wallback is on staff for SB at Home Action Fund. Corey previously served in the Palo Alto City Council. That's where I first met Corey, and he came out as a strong housing advocate. And prior to that, Corey was a district staffer for the state legislature. Corey, take it away, please.
All right, well, thank you very much. And I want to say thank you again to Graciela for all of your work on behalf of the Action Fund and Housing in Sacramento, and for joining us today. I'm also really glad that Senator Wiener was able to join us. Could we go on to the next slide? I'll just run through this pretty quickly. I'm just going to talk first a little bit about what the Action Fund does in local elections, what some of the activities have been that the Action Fund has engaged in over the last couple of years since the Action Fund was created. So on the area of ballot measures, as a 501c4, we can take positions and work in support or in opposition to local ballot measures. One that we're very proud of was Measure E in San Jose, which actually has already raised, I think, over $200 million in funds for the city of San Jose just since March of 2020, and that's a real estate transfer tax for affordable housing. So that's really great news. Another area that we work in is candidate engagement. So although we've never endorsed candidates, what we have done is hosted candidate forums, either on our own or with other organizations, circulated questionnaires to ask candidates to put in writing for us to share with the public what their positions are on different housing policies. And so we've done that in past cycles as well as the current one. And then just generally trying to educate candidates about housing policy. It would be ideal for us if everybody running for office in every seat in every election all shared all of our views about housing. So we try to let them know, here are our positions. Here's what the experts say about how to improve production, preservation of existing affordable housing, how to protect renters, how to do that while being mindful of equity and climate sustainability. So we do try to educate candidates in the same way that we try to educate the public as well. And then on voter education, we want to make sure that voters know about the fact that there are elections coming up. A lot of people don't realize there is an election that you can vote in right now on June 7th. And so we try to get the word out about that, make sure people know how to vote, when to vote, and also taking the information that we get from candidates in the questionnaires and the forums. We try to share that information as well with voters so they can make an informed decision about how candidates line up on housing and how candidates' values and positions on housing line up with voters' positions. And then again, when it comes to ballot measures, even if we haven't worked on a ballot measure as closely as we worked on Measure E, we can still take a position and let people know here are our recommendations on and how a particular ballot measure may positively or negatively impact production, preservation, and protection of housing. Next slide, please. So this year, we have a lot of resources online, so you can go to those websites, and I'll drop the links in the chat as well. But you can read the questionnaires that we collected back from candidates. That's the link I just dropped in the chat. We have several races there, and you can also watch videos of our candidate forums right there. That's a lot of useful information. We hope you'll take advantage of that before you cast your ballots. But don't let that slow you down from casting your ballot before or on June 7th. Go to the next slide, please. So these were the races that we highlighted, chose to highlight with our candidate forums in the current primary season. We partnered with over 24 co-hosting community-based organizations and housing advocacy groups to host these. All of these, you can find the recordings on our YouTube page or the link I just shared. You'll find those recordings in English as well as with Spanish, Vietnamese interpretation options. And for the first one for Senate District 10, we also had a Mandarin Chinese interpretation. So you can find videos for each of those separately. So California Senate District 10, this covers Northeast Santa Clara County, as well as Southern Alameda County. Santa Clara County Supervisorial District 1, this is the southern part of Santa Clara County, where Mike Wasserman is being termed out. San Jose Mayor, obviously Sam Liccardo is being termed out, so a lot of people running for that. San Jose City Council District 3, that's the district around downtown, currently represented by Raul Perales, who's being termed out. In San Jose City Council District 5, that's more the east side of San Jose, represented by Magdalena Carrasco, who's being termed out. We could go on to the next slide. And so for the questionnaires, we only frankly had the capacity to do 5 candidate forums. That was a lot, but we thought they were very worthwhile. But we also did circulate those questionnaires to all of those races and a couple of others, a couple of assembly races, Assembly District 24, currently represented by Alex Lee, who's running for re-election, District 28, which is like Southwest Santa Clara County and Northern Santa Cruz County, represented by Mark Stone, who is stepping down from the legislature. And then also one more council district that we didn't do a question, we did not do a forum for, but we did do a questionnaire, and that's District 1. That's the west side of San Jose. I should mention there is also an election happening in District 7. We didn't get any questionnaires back from the candidates in District 7, so we did not have anything to publish there, but District 7 is also on the ballot, and that's important to remember. If you want to move on to the next slide. So one thing that we have started to do just a little bit with this cycle is early on, so last year, look at especially some of those places where people might be reluctant to run, who are pro-housing, who care about housing production and preservation, protecting tenants. Look at some places where it's challenging to run, challenging to serve, challenging to win. And we've tried to start, it's a tough process, but we've started to try to identify people who might be willing to run, who might be capable of running viable campaigns, or being a campaign manager or some other kind of top-level volunteer on a campaign to try and build the pipeline of people who could run for office or help run those campaigns, so that in the future we can have more people really ready to step up to run for office, whether it's this cycle or in future cycles, ready to run for office, ready to serve in office, ready to help other people get elected, trying to help them understand housing policy issues in depth, and also understanding the nuts and bolts of how to run a campaign and how to effectively run a campaign, and just encouraging them to run when they're ready and to support one another. And so that's something we've just started to do and are looking forward to doing more in the future as well. If you can move on to the next slide. And I just want to emphasize at these events, we always like to have a call to action. And the real call to action is to get ready to vote. So make a plan for yourself, your family, your friends, your neighbors, people you go to school with, people you work with. Make sure you all have a plan to vote on or even before June 7th. You don't have to wait, right? And sometimes it's good to take care of it early in case something comes up, you get sick, car breaks down on the 7th. So learn about the candidates, use those resources we've shared with you, follow those links I put in the chat, see where the candidates stand, and let that help inform the decisions that you make about who to vote for. And a bonus call to action is throughout this cycle, in the primary and the general, let candidates know how you feel. Candidates are very responsive to hearing from the public. They don't want to anger voters, and they want to be responsive to what voters are thinking, not just after the fact, after the election, but before the election as well. So if there's a candidate who has a position that you really disagree with, let them know. And if there's a candidate who you want to see be more courageous and stronger in their housing positions, let them know. And if you really like a courageous position that a candidate is taking, that's also important to let them know, so we can, as voters, reward good behavior. So we can really give people the thanks for taking a hard stand to do the right thing, when sometimes it's not the most popular thing to do. So, let them know when they're, when they're lining up with you or not. So I think we could go on to any questions if you have any, Candace, or anyone in the audience.
Great. Thank you, Corey, for your presentation and for your call to action. I could start us off with a few questions as we wait for audience questions to pop up.
Sure.
First, Corey, any overlap between the state legislation we talked about with Graciela and Senator Wiener and local discussions?
Yeah, there is a lot of intersection here, right? And I'll actually frame it by saying one of the biggest challenges in housing and one of the biggest topics of conversation in Sacramento and locally is local control versus state standards. Typically in the past, the state of California has been very deferential to local government to decide whatever it wants to do when it comes to housing and land use. Over the last few years, some of the bills that Graciela and the senator were talking about you've seen the state legislature take a more assertive role in setting kind of baseline standards. In the same way, they do for educational standards or workplace safety standards or environmental standards. So it's to set some basic, minimum threshold of housing approaches and zoning that cities have to allow. And you've seen people in cities really pushing back on that. And so that is definitely an area of interest. And it's interesting to see, for instance, on SB 9, which was mentioned before, that's a bill that allows people to have a duplex on their single family home or split their lot. And that allows naturally more affordable housing. It might not be cheap, but still more affordable than just, one big house on a big lot. That was a bill passed by legislature last year, super important to the Action Fund. And we see some candidates very much in favor of that, and also really saying, okay, that's the law now. So how are we going to implement it? How do we make the best of it? How to make sure it really works to push affordability and to supply even further. You also see some candidates really going out of their way to say they don't like that. They don't like that state standard. They want to overturn it, which is, of course, disappointing to us to hear.
Great. Thanks, Corey. I know it sounds like you've done quite a bit of work on recruiting and mentorship this past few months and past year. Based on the candidates you're aware of who are considering running or planning on running, are you seeing viable pro-housing candidates?
So in that work, we've been mostly focusing on the smaller cities, the bigger races in Santa Clara, for the county, and also, of course, for the legislature and for San Jose. All of those races have primaries, and we know who's running, and you can look at all that information that we've shared about those candidates. But then the smaller cities, I don't know if everyone realizes this, but San Jose is the only city in Santa Clara County that has a primary. So the June 7th primary, you won't see anything for Palo Alto, Mountain View, Milpitas, Gilroy, Campbell, Los Gatos, all the others. So we'll see who's going to run for those. Candidates can still declare until early August, I believe, for those races. So again, that's where we've tried to encourage people. If somebody shows an interest in housing and maybe they're considering running, they're thinking about it, we might share what information we have to make it easier for them to make that choice. I'm cautiously optimistic, that it would be good always to have at least one fairly pro-housing person on the ballot, right? It's good if voters have a choice. Of course, we always want to see more pro-housing people run and be ready to run viable campaigns. But I think we'll hopefully have at least one pretty pro-housing person in every race. That's fingers crossed for that.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you're feeling a little bit hopeful that we're going to have more pro-housing elected officials, or cautiously hopeful. Yeah, and
actually I'll add another mini call to action, which is, if you or somebody is thinking about running for office and wants to fight for housing and for tenants, think about it seriously. Take it seriously. Feel free to reach out to us, reach out to people who've served in your community or neighboring communities to get some advice. It's a doable thing. I mean, I've done it. It's not easy, but it's definitely doable.
And we certainly need you now. So a couple audience questions, Corey. What sort of changes have you seen among candidates in the last few years, comparing this cycle to prior election cycles?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that really stand out to me there. One is, a few years ago, it was a lot more common for people who were, let's just say, more on the NIMBY end of the spectrum, to be more open about that, to be more just openly hostile to the idea of allowing or encouraging any new affordable housing in their district or in their city. And I think people have realized, candidates have wised up that the public's not going to tolerate that anymore. The public looks at the housing crisis and sees housing affordability and homelessness every day, and the damage that's doing to our region, to our economy, to people's lives, to families, to our schools, losing enrollment, losing teachers. So it's not really politically tenable to be openly hostile to housing now. So what we see instead are people saying, well, of course I care about housing. Of course I care about affordability. I care about homelessness. But then we'll see them maybe oversimplify or misrepresent what's behind the housing crisis, misrepresent the causes of homelessness, and then provide policy solutions that would actually be ineffective or even counterproductive. And so it's important to look at how people say they're going to solve the problems, not just whether they say they care. And so that's, I think, a really big change. And of course, as the crisis has gotten worse, as street homelessness and homelessness in general has gotten worse, you're seeing a lot more attention paid to that issue, I think, than in the past. And sometimes that's very healthy and effective. And sometimes, unfortunately, we see some candidates having a pretty reactionary response to the housing crisis and to homelessness, and even demagoguing our unhoused neighbors in ways that are kind of shocking sometimes. And so that's been a disappointing trend to see. That's not universal. Certainly a lot of candidates really do understand that our neighbors who have been priced out of their homes now are sleeping in their car or struggling to find a place to live. They're not at fault for the economic realities and for the housing crisis that poor policy decisions have really created.
Great. Thank you, Corey. I know we're running out of time, and I know one quick fire question, if you can answer it in a few words. Does the Action Fund make any endorsements?
So as a C4, a 501c4, nonprofit, we are allowed to make endorsements of candidates. We have never done that in the past. It's always an option. So something we're always considering for the future.
Great. I know we had a poll, but I'm not sure if we have time for that unless someone can put it in the chat. I know we had a 3-question poll. Oh, there it is. If we can take 30 seconds to do that in the audience, that would be greatly appreciated. While you're doing that, I wanted just to give a quick Affordable Housing Month reminder. This is our final event for Affordable Housing Month this year. We're uploading video recordings for many of them, and you can find them on the SV at Home website. Please check out those videos of events from throughout the month. We'll put the link in the chat as well. Thank you again to all of our speakers. Corey, thanks for that. Graciela, Senator Weiner, thank you for the audience participation. Thank you for our Affordable Housing Month sponsors. We couldn't do this without you. It's been an amazing month of learning and opportunities for engagement. And we also encourage you to join SV at Home. We definitely believe that everyone deserves a safe and stable home. If you do too, we invite you to join us as a member. When you join SV at Home, we can leverage our resources, magnify our voices, and advance strategic collaborative solutions to California's affordable housing crisis that meets our local and regional needs. Your membership helps support our work, including all of the great Affordable Housing Month events and activities. And you can find the link in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great long Memorial Day weekend, and we are right on time.